onto Hoplite Warfare for the Greeks. So, Hoplite Warfare was the type of warfare that the Greeks used for almost all of their military conquests, as well as fighting against each other, and then fighting against other empires such as the Persians, which we will discuss during the Persian Wars in Lecture Day 6. So, what is Hoplite Warfare, and why is it called that? Well, Hoplite Warfare is named after the soldiers that are working in their military, the hoplites, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, note that all of the members of the Greek military were militia members, okay? They didn't really have a standing military as per se in most of the city-states. Most of the city-states only kind of recruited their militia or their armies when they needed to during a conflict. Otherwise, the people were just, the military was usually just at home doing other jobs. They had other lives. And so it was very similar to what our National Guard is. But instead of having a standing army like our nation does, they only would have had the National Guard, okay? And so they would go and train for several days a year, and then so many such and such, they would go off and fight as well for so many, during certain conflicts. So they were militia. And otherwise, again, they had jobs at home, such as being a pottery person, or a tradesman, or some kind of other craftsman. Maybe they worked on construction or something like that. And most of the people that were doing this were not aristocrats. Usually the aristocrats were in charge and not actually the members of the fighting hoplites. Now, what's a hoplite? Well, the hoplites were the soldiers, the main soldiers. And why were they called hoplites? Well, they were called hoplites because of their hoplon, the hoplon, which is this right here, their shield. Okay, their big giant shield, which, as you can see right here, has multiple parts. You can see that it has usually a metal or leather covering here. Sometimes it was metal, usually very thin bronze. Sometimes it was just leather stretched over the wooden frame. Okay, sometimes it was bronze though, and then they would have had like a leather insert where they would have had straps and handles and things like that. And then this shield was about 3 feet wide, okay, in diameter, about 3 feet. So this massive, massive shield. And it was known as the hoplon, okay? And so people that carried the hoplon were known as hoplites. Well, what were the other weapons for the hoplites? Pretty simple stuff, really. A spear, okay, which is right here, which, as you can see, was about maybe 8 feet, 9 feet tall. Sometimes they were a little longer, maybe up to 10 feet, but usually about anywhere from 6 feet to about 9 feet was typical, okay? They also had very light armor that they wore, and for light armor, they would have been wearing this kind of armor right here, which you can kind of see sometimes would have been leather, sometimes it would have been metal for parts of the plates, but most of the time it would have been their version, which was this kind of cloth, which was stuck to another cloth with some glue, and then stuck to another piece, and stuck to another piece, over and over and over again, so that it was maybe about an inch and a half thick sometimes, and it was just cloth, layered cloth upon layered cloth, and it was very thick and structured. It wouldn't really flex. Sometimes they would put very thin wood in there as well, or maybe a copper plate or something, or bronze plate, but it was very, very simple armor mostly, and very easy to make. They would, of course, had a bronze or copper, or maybe even later on an iron helmet, as well as greaves, which were for their shin guards, basically. They would have worn sandals. This guy doesn't have shoes in this picture, but they would have worn sandals, which was typical for footwear back then. They also would have carried maybe a sword or a dagger, like a knife. But their main weapon was the spear, and the reason why was because of the way they fought, which was in the Phalanx Formation. The Phalanx Formation. And so let's talk about what a phalanx is before heading back to that hoplite class, okay? And so this is what a phalanx would have looked like. Men right next to each other. Again, this would have been all men back then, and they likely would not have been aristocrats. Very few of aristocrats would have actually served in the military at all. And they would have fought like this, where, say, they're all right next to each other, right close up and personal, where their shield is helping not just shield themselves, the person carrying it, but also covering part of the person next to them and overlapping with it. And they would have designed their shields to have pictures of the gods, maybe their city or town or poleis or something symbol on it, sometimes a family symbol or an animal or something on there. Sometimes they would have just been completely just blank, okay? And so it varied, but this is a more colorful picture. They would have lined up in rows, okay? And then immediately right behind them, almost to the point where they couldn't move back, was the next row of men, also with their hoplons and shields as well. And so what they would have ended up having was they would be carrying their shield. This guy's wrong because he's carrying his sword. He wouldn't be doing that. He'd be carrying his shield and his spear, okay? And the spear would be over top. And over top and kind of resting on the metal shield, the hoplon, or metal or wood shield. As well as people behind using their spears as well. And so the spear being so long, maybe 3 or 4 people backwards behind the front guy, or at least 2 or 3 behind him, were able to also stab at the enemy, okay? And now what would the enemy be like? Well, exactly identical, right? If against Greeks. If against another group, like the Persians, which we'll talk about in Lecture 6, they would have been, differently armed and weaponed, and stuff like that. But the phalanx would basically fight against another phalanx most of the time, and it was whichever one would kind of run away first would be the loser. And it would basically be they would be stabbing at each other, helping each other. If a person were to fall and die, the person behind would immediately take that spot. Sometimes they did tricks where, like, a person here would get tired or whatever, and that this person would use their shields to cover where his position was so he could retreat back, and another person could go up and move into his place. Stuff like that. It was very, very interesting. I've got a couple videos, or at least one video I will post on Canvas that will show you it. This is a picture of it, but the video won't work with the way I'm recording the videos. So for this video, so I'll link it for you. This is, of course, was from a modern movie, the movie Troy, but it's very similar to what the phalanx would have been doing. Again, large shields. Now, this would have been a bit wrong because of the shape of the shield, because this isn't a hoplon, but this would have been very similar to the Phalanx Formation. Okay, and so the Phalanx Formation was basically how they fought. And then again, like I said, they would fight until one side got tired and the other one would go home, and the other one would declare victory, because usually there were still soldiers left at the end of the battle from both sides. Now, what did the hoplite class happen to it? Well, over time, eventually the people that were fighting in their phalanx together would start realizing they're all kind of downtrodden by the aristocrats, and that they sometimes wanted more rights, sometimes more money, sometimes some other kind of form of compensation for fighting, or just realizing that they're all politically the same and that they all should maybe work together. And so what ends up happening is this hoplite class develops, where it's almost an entire class structure on their own, below the aristocrats. And so they eventually, in the year 600 BCE, start demanding rights on their own. And so eventually, the aristocrats and the people in power are forced to give some more rights, such as voting and stuff like that, to the hoplites, which we will see in an instance in Athens as well as in Sparta. So let's move on to Sparta while we're talking about the military, because Sparta is very militaristic. And this is a picture of the Spartan military, where they would have all had red crests and usually the symbol of their nation right there on their bronze-covered shields. Sparta was one that took military pride very seriously, as you'll see in the next slide. So, where is Sparta? Sparta is right here, okay, in Greece, okay, right there, while Athens is right here. Very close neighbors, but they are sometimes allies and sometimes they are enemies, depending on the years, okay? But Sparta becomes very powerful. And so we'll talk about them for a few more moments than anywhere else. Okay, so about Spartan society. Spartan society was very unique because not only did they have a monarchy where they have a king, okay, a monarchy is a form of government that has a king or a queen, but back then almost always a king, okay. They had a dual monarchy, meaning that they had two kings ruling at the exact same time, okay? And these were formed from the two most aristocratic families in Sparta originally. And then they just kind of handed down the title of king to the next person afterwards, after that. Well, Sparta, over time, was relatively peaceful starting out, okay? Until they conquered an area near the poleis, the city itself, and conquered an area called Messenia. Messenia was the area right near it, okay? And when they conquered the Messenians, okay, the people of Messenia, they decided, okay, they were going to basically make the Messenian people servants, okay? And they started naming these servants the Helots, okay? The Messenians became known as the Helots, okay? That was the Spartan name for the Messenian people. Well, over time, in the year 720 BCE, the Helots decided to fight back, okay? And so they no longer had peace or ruling over each other, and the Messenian War began, and eventually the Spartans won and conquered it. Well, after several generations, the Messenians decided to want freedom and revolted in the year 650 BCE, which resulted in what is known as the Second Messenian War, okay? After the Spartans beat the Messenians in that second war, they started realizing these Messenians, the Helots, are going to possibly revolt again in the future. And we have two choices. One choice is we free them, okay, and give them back their land. Or two, we become very militarized and we make ourselves a military power. And we devote ourselves, the Spartan men, to full-on military combat, and we make sure that the Messenians will never be able to revolt against us again, and if they were, we'd easily beat them, not to mention anyone else. And what option did they take? Well, they took option 2. Sparta decided to militarize. And so that creates a culture in Sparta known as the barracks culture. And a barracks is basically an apartment building or area for troops. We call them barracks today. Our soldiers live in barracks, okay, for the most part. Sometimes they buy houses or apartments elsewhere for their families and live with them. But usually if they're young, new soldiers in our military, even today, they are usually living on base in a barracks, which is like a big apartment or dormitory, okay? And so they decide they will have a barracks culture. And we'll talk about the barracks culture on the next slide, okay? But first, let's talk about the rest of Spartan government. Sparta also had several other parts of their government other than just the dual monarchy. Yes, they had the two kings that made kind of the final say in decisions and things, but they also developed a citizens' assembly, a legislature, okay? Which is basically what? Kind of like our Congress or Senate, and it included all men that were Spartans, okay? Had to be Spartans. Sorry, Helots, you were not allowed. Helots were basically now slaves, okay, at this time. And after the 650, definitely slaves. And these all men in the Apella that were, or all men in Sparta in general that were not Helots, were allowed to be part of the Apella as long as they were at least 30 years old or older, okay? All men over the age of 30 could be in the Apella. And again, over top of the Apella, you had the two kings, and then you had 28 elders that were kind of like better than the rest of the Apella, and those elders had to be at least 60 years old or over, okay, or older. And so not all of the people that were 60 years old were part of it, but at least 28 of them were, and were counted as the elders, and they kind of had like a more of a say than the rest of them, okay, when it came to voting and stuff like that. They also had like this other branch of government called the ephors, okay? The ephors, there were 5 of them, okay? Each one a person, single person, and these ephors were elected each year. And these ephors had a job where they were supposed to supervise the education and traditions of Spartan traditions and Spartan culture. Make sure that people were being trained and educated in the ways of Sparta's traditions, as well as the military, that it was doing its job to be trained the way it should be, and that it would always be trained up to the same standards, which was extremely high standards, as you'll see in a minute, etc. So that's what the E4s had their job to do. And they also were responsible for overseeing the Cryptea, or Cryptea. The Cryptea was this group of, basically spies or secret service, where they would kind of spy on things, maybe on the Helots, maybe on other polis, city-states, etc. like that, and kind of report back to the E4s about any possible dangers, or if the Helots were planning another revolution, the Cryptea would be able to warn the E4s, and then the E4s would go to the Appella and say, hey, the military needs to be called in to do this, or here is the intelligence info on this issue, okay? And so that's what the Cryptea was. They were basically spies. Moving on, let's talk about Spartan military culture and the barracks culture. So, at first, when a child was born, a baby, of male or female, okay, in Sparta, they were inspected, usually by the E4s or a similar other kind of person, okay, someone similar to it in the E4s, okay, and they would check the baby for any deformities, if they looked malnourished, or anything like that, anything at all, and they thought that wasn't normal or superior, like Spartans' babies should be, because they figured that they should all be superior to other Greeks at this time. The baby was taken and left out in the wilderness, okay? I know it sounds absolutely horrible, and that's kind of what it is. But they thought that any kind of abnormality, any kind of disfigurement, anything, if they didn't look like they were going to be physically strong enough when they got older to serve in the military, or expected to be a strong Spartan woman, they were left in the wilderness to die. Absolutely horrible by our standards today, but back then, that's what they thought was normal. Okay? And so, babies were first inspected. If they were a male, at age 7, that baby would leave, or that child at that point, because they're a young boy, would leave their home and go off to military school. And they would stay at military school all day and all night, kind of like boarding school, okay? If it was a girl, it would stay with its family, okay? The girl would stay with the family and be starting to also be trained, okay? But in a different way. Not in the military, but in homekeeping, as well as some little fighting and gymnastics, etc. like that. They were taught very interesting stuff as a girl. They were taught that they needed to be very strong and physically fit because they were expected, when they had children, to give birth to strong children. This was kind of very similar to eugenics, today it's called, where you kind of this breeding of a superior race. Well, Sparta kind of began that idea, okay? And it's not necessarily true at all, right? You being physically fit does not mean necessarily that your children will be completely physically fit, okay? Things happen genetically that we can't control on a day-to-day health basis and stuff, but they thought they could. So while girls were being taught from exercise, gymnastics, and know how to even fight a little bit and defend themselves, as well as being told a little bit else about like how to run the home on their own and to make sure that the helots weren't being acting up and stuff like that, the boys were off at military school. And so what was happening for the boys at military school? Well, at 7 years old, they went off to military school, and they would live there their entire lives, almost, or a long portion of it, as you'll see, okay? And so they would live in the barracks with the rest of the military. Now, each, level of children would have their own level of, barracks, okay? Finally, after a few years, they were finally given their first haircut at age 12. Or their first haircut since they became age 7, okay? Once they got to military school. They would only do these haircuts every few years. And it was kind of this process. And at age 12, they were given a red cloak, which was the Spartan symbol for this country. Okay, you can kind of see the red cloak here, like a cape. They were also paired with another boy, okay, which was basically their bunkmate in the bunk bed next to them or below them or whatever. And they were basically taught, you and him, the two of you, life forever. That's how it's going to be. You two are going to have to fight and work with each other for the rest of your lives. That when we go to war, he will be the person with the shield next to you, or right behind you, fighting right with you all the way, okay, no matter what, kind of thing. As well as training, everything. If one of you falls behind in training and needs to be disciplined, both of you get disciplined together. And that was something that happened during daily inspections. They had to be up to par, or up to snuff, as the highest caliber soldier, even at age 12, as good as they could get. They were still training. They were training at this point, and they had been training since age 7. And at this point, things were getting serious at age 12. They were not ever to show emotion. If they were beaten. If they failed a daily inspection, they were beaten. If they had a problem in the mess hall or something like that, and didn't clean up after them, or maybe didn't eat their full meal or whatever like that, they were beaten. They were usually not given enough food, so there was no real reason for them not to want to eat all of their meal, because they were given very small amounts of food. And so, but the Spartan boys at this age, even at age 12, were told, you should probably go and try to steal food from the helots and belongings from the helots, because we're not going to give you a blanket, an extra blanket. You get one blanket, and it gets cold in the barracks when there's no fire lit at night. And so it's going to get very cold at the barracks during the winter, and you might freeze to death if you don't get an extra blanket. But we're not going to give you one. It is your job to go and steal one. But they would encourage it. They wouldn't directly say, go steal one. They would kind of hint at it. In addition to that, they also would kind of push the idea that if you get caught stealing, and this was true, that if you get caught stealing, you would get punished. Again, beaten severely. And not just you. The boy that you were paired with was also punished equally. And so they were also encouraging the boys of the Spartan military at age 12, to go and steal from the helots. Not regular Spartans, but the helots. Because again, there are lower classes, the Spartans, okay? They're not a Spartan, they're kind of slaves. Go steal their food, go steal their blankets and stuff. And so that was what they were taught at age 12 and encouraged. They were also having daily marches, exercises, fighting techniques, all of it from age 7 onwards. By age 20, they could officially join the military, and they automatically were inducted into the military at age 20, and they got another haircut. At age 20, they also were able to get married. And I put married in quotes there because their marriage was kind of frowned upon in Sparta. Marriage was frowned upon because that you would be possibly loyal to something else other than just being loyal to the state of Sparta. So, yes, they wanted you to get married so you would have strong Spartan children, but they didn't necessarily want you to really have loyalty to your wife. Also, you weren't allowed to go live at home with your wife that you got married, that you probably had only maybe met once or twice during the past few years, if that. It was usually an arranged marriage. The daughter had to live at home, okay, with her parents still, and you had to still live in the barracks. And you were not allowed to go see her. The only way to go see her is if you snuck out at night, or when you weren't practicing during the middle of the day, to go see her. And so this caused a lot of problems, and caused many, and what happens if you're caught? Beaten. Again. And so it's this very harsh kind of military culture in Sparta that started at a young age for them, and it's still continuing. Still, if you need more food because you're not getting enough food, go steal it from the helots. Same with blankets or anything else. What if you want to give your wife something nice and pretty? How are you going to get it? You're going to have to steal it. Or at least sneak out to go buy it. And again, if you're caught, beaten. By age 30, you could actually now live at home with your wife, and at that point, they could also join what? The Apella at age 30. Okay? The Citizens' Assembly. But, yes, you could live with your wife full-time, but you still had to train with your Spartan brothers, okay, your Spartan soldier brothers. You still had to eat in the barracks. Every single meal, all 3 meals a day, had to be eaten in the main barracks. So you couldn't even eat at home. Now, maybe your wife would make you something extra because she knew you weren't getting enough food, but the rest had to be eaten at home, at the military base. And finally, at age 60, you could retire from the military. Sparta is really the only one of these city-states at all in Greece that was like this. Many of the others were very similar to the other hoplites, where you had jobs the rest of the time at home. Sparta, your job was the military, and your loyalty was the military. And sadly, due to this right here, and being paired with other boys, and having your entire life only with other men, and not ever getting to know women, didn't really work out long-term for Sparta. And eventually, over time, birth rates declined. People decided it wasn't worth getting married. I didn't have love for this woman because I never met her until we were married. And then I get in trouble if I go try to see her? What's the point? And so things ended up not going well for Sparta long-term because of these things, but early on, for a very long time, it does work out for Sparta being the powerful military power that they are. Okay? So, let's move on to Athens, which is their neighbor, which isn't far. Okay, so Athens is right here, Sparta was right here, okay? And so, if you saw the map, right? Sparta, Athens. Okay, Sparta, Athens. Athens has an area of the city-state around it, or the poleis around it, called Attica. The reddish area on this map, or Attica, because they also own that island down there. And so this was the name of the territory belonging to the city-state or polis of Athens. It was Attica. Athens was actually situated around this very large rocky hill, okay, called the Acropolis, which was in the center of the main city, which is right here. You can see the Acropolis here and the rest of the city here. They built, of course, city walls around it for defense. They had a river that flowed from out the river, from out the city, which actually started from springs and stuff in the Acropolis area and trickled down the Acropolis on the side, as well as coming up from underneath it and starting in this area, as well as a few other small streams that flowed into it, into the city. But eventually it formed up into a larger river, which would flow all the way out to the sea, okay, to the Aegean Sea right about here. Okay, because again, Athens is here and the water would flow out to there. So the Acropolis is this large area here. That's the Acropolis, where they built several palaces, or not palaces, temples to it, temples to the gods on it. And this is actually a video that I've got. Again, it won't unfortunately work, but you can see the side of the Acropolis here. This is modern day video, taken only about a year ago. And this is actually the rest of the video right here. I will link the video, if possible, below. I'm not sure if I will be able to or not with this one. But this right here is the Acropolis right here, as opposed to the rest of the city below. And that's one of the or one of the temples right there on it, the Parthenon. Okay, Parthenon temple, and you can see the Acropolis and the rocky outcrops up to it, the cliffs. Okay, so that is Athens. So let's talk very briefly about early Athenian government, starting with a man named Draco. Okay, Draco. And so to get to Draco, we'll talk about him in just a minute. First, let's talk about what the Athenian government is first. Okay, the Athenian government was known as the Areopagus, or the Areopagus. Okay, depending on how you wish to pronounce it. But the Areopagus was made up of 9 archons. 9 archons. These were elected, okay? And they each served for 1 year before having a re-election, okay? The archons means first men. Archon means first man. Archons, plural, first men, okay? They would serve for 1 year before having to get either re-elected or if they failed for re-election, then they would become part of this larger council, okay, made up of basically all men that were of not necessarily voting age, but were given voting rights in Athens, and depending on the year, that varied on how many it was, and whether if everybody was part of it or not. Kind of like Sparta, with everybody being 30, and the higher in the Apella, the Areopagus, the kind of body that was above the Areopagus, or with the Areopagus, was kind of much bigger or smaller depending on the year. Don't worry about that. You don't need to know that. Just know that if the Archon didn't get reelected, they could be part of still government still, okay? And have some say, just not the main say, which was the 9 of them. Draco, or Dracon, depending on the writing of him, was became Archon in the 620s BCE, okay? And he was the first person, the first Archon, to have the idea that we should probably write these laws down that we keep making. Because until then, they were not written down, until the 620s, okay? Instead, they were only told by word of mouth. And so word of mouth could change what things meant, and what if someone misunderstood something, they would maybe tell the next person the wrong thing. And so that ended up happening quite often, and so the laws needed to be written down, and so he eventually came up with the idea, let's write them down. Eventually, he also pushes for several new laws happening in Athens, which became known as the Draconian laws in 621 BCE, because he was elected in that year and was serving as Archon, or part of the Areopagus, in that year. And what these Draconian laws became were known because of harsh punishment for even minor crimes, okay? Draconian today, we'll talk about that in a minute, why it means what it does, but harsh punishment, okay, for any crime. Any crime. If you steal something, it's going to be a harsh punishment. Might lose a hand. Might end up having to serve for a long time just for stealing something as simple as a loaf of bread or something like that. He also started something called debt slavery, where if you fell into debt, meaning you could not pay taxes or your money to a certain person or whatever, possibly it usually happened to people that lost jobs, they could be sold into slavery. If you ran out of money, you could be sold into slavery. As opposed to going to prison, you would just be sold into slavery to work off your debt. And over time, you could work off your debt and be freed, okay? And then lastly, he made a distinction between homicide and manslaughter, okay? You know what homicide is. That's actually murdering someone. But manslaughter is when someone dies from actions you do, but it might have been an accident, possibly, okay? What if you run someone over with your horse or something like that? Or you accidentally stab someone, okay? Or something like that, or drop something on someone and they die. That's manslaughter rather than homicide, right? You didn't mean to kill them. But, so until then, homicide and manslaughter were the same crime. Draco, on the Draconian laws of 621 BCE, make the distinction that they are different. The main part to take away from the Draconian laws is that the harsh punishments, though, as well as the debt slavery. And that is why we have something called Draconian today. You may have heard of it today, and it doesn't mean dragons or anything like that. It means Draconian means harsh, okay? It's this idea of harsh or very strict, okay? And so that is why it is today Draconian is strict or harsh, because of these laws, which were harsh punishments to basically all crimes, okay? And this is actually a tablet which shows some of the earliest Draconian laws, and this is a pottery image from that period as well, of the Archons. We will talk about Solon and further Athenian government in Lecture Day 6, along with the Persian Wars, as well as get into the beginning of the Peloponnesian War.